Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Hold My Drink, where we navigate the news and politics with a chaser of civility. I'm your host, Jen, inviting you to grab your favorite beverage, sit back, and imagine with us how to create a new American identity together. Welcome to this week's Hold My Drink and Counterweight podcast with my co-host, David Bernstein. Today, we have Aaron Sibarium with us. He is with the Washington Free Beacon, and a lot to discuss with him. But before we do, Aaron, it is a holiday weekend. Did you bring anything to the table for this discussion?
I don't have anything at the table right now, but last night I had a little bottle of cold sake, Japanese wine.
Ooh, that's a new one.
That was good. It was good.
Nice. David, what about you?
Well, at the time of this recording, it's about to be Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. So I brought Fireball whiskey, which probably is not really associated with the holiday, but it's cinnamon, so and sort of apples, and I don't know. It was the best I could do. I didn't have any apple schnapps or anything like that. So
okay,
cheers.
well, so before we get to that, you've got to tell me: is there something you do that? I love learning about the holidays. Is there something with Rosh Hashanah where apples and cinnamon has?
Apples and honey are the traditional food. So
Okay.
dip an apple in honey, and you've pretty much done the holiday.
Well, and now can you drink during the holiday, or
yes,
you can? So
you
this
can
is a holiday
drink.
that you can absolutely drink. Okay.
You
good.
can absolutely drink. Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, that's coming up in a little bit. That's when you can't eat or drink. So,
okay.
But this is celebratory. This is all good.
Okay. All right. Well, and then I'm still on my Texas seltzer kick. So my spiked seltzer today is agave and lime. So not as fun as your Fireball.
Excellent.
Well, take us away, David.
So I've had the chance to get to know Aaron a bit. Aaron has a very unique niche in covering anti-wokeness, really. I think you could say, Aaron, correct me if I'm wrong, you sort of, in addition to whatever else you cover, you have sort of an anti-woke beat. Two stories that I saw came out from Aaron that I thought were both groundbreaking in a way. One was the role of private school accrediting institutions in sort of imposing coercive ideologies on private schools. And the other was the role, the current work of the American Bar Association in forcing law schools to adopt DEI and certain hiring standards as well. And so maybe we should start there. First of all, tell us a little bit about how you came to this beat at the Washington Free Beacon.
Well, I would say the story begins in late October, early November 2015, when I was at Yale University at the height of the Christakis affair, Halloweengate, whatever you want to call it, this sort of nationwide uprising of woke college students that began at Yale, but then quickly spread to other institutions too. That I was the opinion editor of the Yale Daily News at the time, and that experience did play some role in what you might call my radicalization. It made me realize that things were bad and the insanity was a lot more deeply rooted than I had thought. And at that moment, I kind of realized, wow, the future judges, future lawyers, future politicians, some of them are going to believe this crap. And sure enough, over the next, I guess now half decade, we've seen more and more institutions capitulate to this ideology. And so I've been sort of worried about this and seen it up close for a while. And I would say that's largely how I eventually came to the Free Beacon and ended up wanting to cover this because there's this meme that it's just sort of fragile college kids walking on eggshells, that you can't take a joke. That's not really a sufficient account of what's going on. I mean, and you don't see people saying that as much anymore, but it was popular for a while. But no, the reality is that as those college students become the staff of institutions as they graduate, the institutions are transformed and wokeism becomes institutionalized. So the
Mhm.
idea that the real world would just destroy this ideology, that it wouldn't survive contact with reality, that just proved to be wrong. Instead, what happened was this ideology transformed reality. And so, what I try to do is chronicle the specific kind of institutional levers by which this ideology gains power first and then exerts it second.
Hmm. So that must have been a very harrowing time during Halloweengate at Yale. I'm curious to know a little bit about what it was like to be somebody who didn't agree with the student mob in that situation, how that affected your social life, how it affected your standing at the newspaper. What was that like for you?
Um, I was fortunate enough to have a good group of friends who either agreed with me or at least did not regard disagreement as a sign of moral evil. And so it didn't really affect my social life too much. I mean, there were people who really hated my guts, but they weren't the kinds of people I would have probably been friends with or wanted to be friends with anyway. As to how it affected life at the paper, I mean, people knew that I wasn't a fan of it, and so there were definitely some tensions. Frankly, the dissidents were so outnumbered that at a certain point you learn to pick your battles, and this was one where just you weren't going to win. We were going to cover it from a particular point of view. The coverage was going to be slanted in one direction, and there wasn't a whole lot any individual could do about that. Um, but I mean, it was fine. And after I finished being the opinion editor, I did that when I was a sophomore, so I had 2 years afterwards to just write columns. Because when you're an editor, they don't want you to write, but once you're done with it, you can go back to writing. So when I started writing columns again, I, kind of went on a one man, culture war against against wokeism at Yale, and like occasionally I'd write something that really pissed people off, and I got a lot of crap on Facebook for it. You just kind of learn to deal with it. I think it thickened my skin in a very healthy way, actually. Uh,
Hmm.
so yeah, I mean, I guess once or twice someone came up to me in Starbucks and said something mean, but it wasn't terrible. And again, I mean, I also would say it like had I cared what people were saying at any given moment, whatever anyone was saying, it would have been tough. But you just learn to not give a shit,
Hmm.
and that's the key.
Hmm. So you've done these two stories that I've mentioned. There are others as well. Um, Tell us what you're finding about how these ideas are becoming institutionalized. And you can use the case studies of the ABA and the private school accreditation and maybe draw some broader inferences about what's happening.
Sure. So I'll start with those, and then I'll broaden out. So uh, both the ABA and the private school accreditation process is a story of how certifying and credentialing institutions are captured by ideologues, and then how adherence to the ideology becomes simply a requirement for certification and legitimacy. It's almost seen as, apolitical. It's not even an ideological thing. It's just, this is what we do. This is just what you do to be accredited and to be legitimate. Um, and so the danger of this capture is that it depoliticizes, or at least creates the illusion of depoliticization around what is in fact a highly political uh, ideology. Um, and it does so in institutions that are set up to enforce that ideology, precisely because the institutions are supposed to be, above ideology and just kind of neutral technocratic arbiters of, of whether you're teaching kids law or math or science or what have you. Um, and that same process, I would argue, is playing out in other institutions, not just private or law school accreditation. I have a piece forthcoming about this. By the time the podcast is out, it'll already be out, on the CDC and how, what the CDC put out, this like inclusive language guide for healthcare professionals, how to speak inclusively, which is loaded with jargon. It says that biologically male and female are terms to be avoided, because, and it cites the activist group GLAAD, which is not exactly a moderate group at all. But, it does this, and it's framed as just, here are some terms that, healthcare professionals think are, better and non-stigmatizing. And here are a list of resources and references if you'd like to learn more about these issues. And it cites GLAAD as if it's a scientific authority. It also cites the American Public Health Association, which you think is a scientific authority, but then you go to its, quote, health equity fact sheets, and the health equity fact sheets say that enforcing eviction moratoriums is an important part of public health, and the CDC, of course, was doing that until a few weeks ago when the Supreme Court blocked it. And as you go through this report and you go through what they're citing, it becomes very clear that what's going on is that this ideology is being woven into the very language of official medicine. And so again, it's being depoliticized. It's essentially ideological character is being masked under this kind of technocratic veneer. And that's happening at the CDC, the highest level of public health bureaucracy. And so what you see is that the very sort of, best practices, the very sort of criteria for legitimacy and for sort of just scientific accuracy, so to speak, that becomes identical from a sociological standpoint with the dictates of wokeism. So science itself is being wokeified, and precisely because it's science, it's hard to see that it's being wokeified, since it's hidden behind the fact-based, objective, neutral language of science. So it's really happening everywhere.
Yeah, this issue with healthcare institutions, as you say, seems particularly problematic, particularly public health institutions during a pandemic. You worry that the more politicized they're perceived by the public, the less the public is going to trust any public health guidelines that they get. And have you seen evidence of that? Have you seen evidence that the public is losing trust in these institutions, or that and you could broaden that from public health as well, because they're getting highly politicized guidelines?
Yeah. So here's one example. I think of the loss of trust, the kind of pharmaceutical culture war that we find ourselves in, where everyone's arguing about ivermectin and vaccines, stuff like that.
Yes.
There's an interesting pattern you'll notice, which is that things that are not very effective, like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, and things that are very effective, like vaccines and to a lesser extent monoclonal antibodies, both become objects of culture war. And things that are in the middle and kind of like objectively they work, but they don't work super well. I'm thinking of the antidepressant drug fluvoxamine, which is done decently in clinical trials. No one pays attention to the stuff that's in the middle. It's all the stuff that either does work or doesn't work, like very unambiguously. And I think the reason for this is that people don't trust the public health establishment. So, if the public health establishment issues, in many cases, I think a scientifically correct verdict that something is really good or really bad, it immediately raises people's suspicions that, they're lying, they're not telling us the whole truth, and dissident voices are being censored, right? You don't see that with the middling efficacy drugs. People just don't care. It's all the ones where it seems very straightforward and you think there would be the least controversy that there's the most. And I think
Right.
it's because people are like, oh, there's not enough scientific controversy among the experts. They're colluding. Something's going on there. This is about the narrative. And it's unfortunate because many times the public health officials are actually right and the vaccines actually do work.
Right.
And ivermectin, while it may not be a death sentence or anything, it like probably is not going to cure you of COVID. It's not a silver bullet. But when the public health officials are so nakedly ideological, I think it fuels this kind of culture war around COVID, and including even this sort of pharmaceutical culture war within that culture war that has been on the news so much in recent weeks.
And it fuels the mistrust too. I think that you
Yes.
mentioned. I mean, I see some people now just digging in their heels completely illogically around these vaccines, but it's only because it's become so political that they've started to dig in
Yeah.
their heels, right? And if we found a way to depoliticize it, I think you'd have more people getting the vaccine. But now it's just become like, just thumbing their nose at the administration, if you will.
Right. No, I think that's it. I mean, the other thing I would just say is that some amount of politicization was probably inevitable because of how polarized the country is. But like I think the particular kind of politicization we had and the sort of partisan polarities, maybe it was baked in, but I think it's a little more contingent and path dependent than people realize. Like, suppose Trump had gone hardcore with lockdowns, and aggressively promoted the vaccine at every possible opportunity, instead of the whole stolen election thing. Like, if all his ammo on that had been spent telling people to get the shot, I bet you would have seen a far more liberals who are, if not outright anti-vaxxers, then certainly anti-vax curious. You even did see a little of it during in the run up to the election, where Kamala Harris said something like, if Trump says to take the shot, I don't know if I'm going to trust it, which was a stupid thing to say. And in other countries, it's been the right that has pushed lockdowns and the left that's resisted them. I think that's the case in Israel, and I don't know if there's as much of an organized left anymore in Hungary, but certainly in Hungary, you had Orban who pushed for lockdowns and things like that. So it really, the polarization may be baked in, but I'm not sure the alignment of the polls is
Hmm.
some iron law of politics. I think it could have very easily been otherwise, which is one reason that although I have very little patience for anti-vaxxers, I also have very little patience for the tendency of smug liberals to be like, oh, ha ha ha, those Trumpy conservatives who won't get the vaccine, they're killing themselves. First of all, as of a few weeks ago, only 27% of young African Americans were vaccinated. And, the New York Times, to its credit, ran a story on that, but like it's really a statistic that blows up a lot of the simplistic narratives. And B, like, yeah, do we really think that liberals would be so smug if uh, Trump voters were enthusiastically getting the vaccine and it was, still maybe, African Americans who weren't? I bet the tone would be totally, totally different. So yeah, I have very little patience for that kind of smugness.
You make such an important distinction. I mean, the polarization is so grave, but the polls, I mean, I think exactly what you said, because the polls shift, that shows the polarization, right? That, I mean,
Yeah,
we will almost blindly go one way or the other, depending on what poll, we align with, that just, it's polarization writ
yeah,
large.
yeah. Well, I mean, look, like at the very start of this, I mean, it was in fact conservatives who took COVID more seriously in January and February. It wasn't necessarily mainstream conservatives, but you saw these weird right wing anonymous accounts who were very worried about what was going on in Wuhan. And relatively early on, you had Tom Cotton raising alarms about a possible bioweapon in a laboratory that leaked, and everyone's like, it's a crazy far right conspiracy theory. Then it turns out, oh, well, that might have happened. The U.S. intelligence agencies aren't sure. But yeah, it flipped really quickly. Like it was totally it was a right wing thing to be worried about. Then it was a left wing thing to be worried about. It's basically stayed that way for a while. I think partly because of Trump and partly because there's just such deep distrust of the public health bureaucrats on the American right. But, even throughout the course of the pandemic, it's not like the polls were fixed. They moved around, over the span of a few months, which just, I think, goes to show how path dependent it is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I want to ask you a little bit more about the American Bar Association and its I don't think it's ruled yet, right, Aaron?
No, it is not. It is not.
It is strongly contemplating putting DEI standards. That was then met with some opposition from professors at Yale Law School. What is the state of play there? What are they actually trying to do? And is anybody opposing it?
Well, so fortunately, a lot of people are opposing it. So there were these 10 Sterling and emeritus professors, which is the highest rank at Yale Law School. They all signed this very strong letter to the American Bar Association opposing it. Brian Leiter at the University of Chicago, some others. So there's certainly opposition. I will say I was on a public Zoom meeting for sort of their accreditation committee a couple weeks ago, which was hosted like a day or two after my piece came out, and no one at the meeting really indicated any serious concerns with the plan as written, or at least not serious concerns with the legal issues that the Yale law professors raised. The Yale law professors noted that the language in one of the guidelines was ambiguous and could be read as encouraging schools to violate federal anti-discrimination law in order to achieve diversity, which is like pretty outrageous for a law school accrediting body to force its accredited schools to even just tiptoe around, not even necessarily break the law, but still to just go up to the line of what is and isn't legal. It's pretty crazy. But they don't, so far I have not heard that any indication that they're backing away from it. They haven't finalized it yet, so it's possible that if enough people oppose it, they'll quietly drop that particular proposal. But yeah, it's good that there's some pushback to it. It might be successful, but it does seem like sort of the bureaucrats, the most sort of central bureaucratic operatives within the ABA, don't seem particularly concerned about all the outrage that the plan has engendered.
Hey, Aaron, for our listeners, can you give a little background on what exactly it is the ABA is proposing?
Yeah, sure. So basically there's two things. One is, three. So one is mandatory anti-bias, anti-racism training, the content of which they will not dictate. They just are going to make you do it. Two is a mandatory professional responsibility kind of ethics class in which your students are required to learn that fighting racism is an obligation of lawyers. So they are dictating curricular content there, and they have not backed off that proposal, which also got a lot of people angry because it was, infringing on academic freedom, forcing law schools to teach something. You'd have to teach that, racism exists in the legal profession in some form, and that it's lawyers' obligation to rectify it. That's part of the plan. And then the third component, which, I find particularly galling, is schools have to take active, effective action. They don't say affirmative action, they say effective action, but it's pretty clear what they mean, to diversify their student bodies. They don't offer any specific objective criteria for what would be sufficient to meet this standard or how diverse they'd have to be. But there's a line in there that says, you can't cite, law schools won't be allowed to cite federal anti-discrimination laws preventing consideration of race or ethnicity in admissions as a justification for not meeting that standard. So they don't say violate the law. They just say if the law is preventing you from effectively diversifying your student body, sorry, you're out of luck. We're not going to take that as an excuse. So, I mean, what it really does, I think, is it encourages schools to do what Harvard is doing, which is to not set an official racial quota, but to play all these games with like personality tests or what have you, in order to achieve some kind of racial balance. And then, of course, the schools will say, "Oh, we're not doing racial quotas. We're just implementing a set of policies that has the exact same effect as setting racial quotas." So yeah, I think the most plausible outcome of this, if they go through with the plan, is that you just see an intensification, and more schools adopting kind of the pseudo quota system that Harvard already adopts.
Mhm. Yeah, and you also have looked at the private school accreditation process. Tell us about that story.
Yeah, so the private school accreditation, it's there's a subset of private schools. I mean, there's a lot of private schools in the United States, and they're not all like this. But the best ones and the most famous ones, the ones you've probably heard of, they're all part of this thing called the National Association for Independent Schools. And the National Association of Independent Schools is like a supra accreditor. It maintains a list of approved regional accreditors, and kind of outlines good practices it expects them to adopt and enforce. And so what that means is that, if you want to be part of the National Association for Independent Schools, you have to go to one of these accreditors who themselves are basically beholden to the National Association of Independent Schools. And the National Association of Independent Schools says that all accreditors have to make sure that schools are promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion, which, of course, the National Association for Independent Schools defines in practice as supporting Ibram Kendi, Robin DiAngelo, that kind of thing. And those figures and others who are similar have done conferences with the National Association for Independent Schools, done conferences with their regional accreditors. I mean, it's very clear what they take diversity, equity, and inclusion to mean. And then the other side of this is that there are a lot of DEI consultants who have ties to the accreditation agencies, including in some cases they may even be the same people. Like the guy who runs a lot of the diversity programming at the National Association for Independent Schools is also the head of a DEI consultancy group called the Glasgow Group, and all the consultants in that group have positions with the NAIS, and some have positions with other accreditors too. So in practice, there's the flagrant conflicts of interest where you'll have an administrator at a private school who's also part of a consulting group, who's also part of the accreditation body that's accrediting the private school. And so, that person will say, "Oh, why don't we hire my consulting group in order to maintain compliance with these DEI accreditation standards?" And that the result of this is that the wokeism is basically just a requirement to be accredited by this big, rather prestigious independent school organization. And so, sure enough, all the independent schools have gone woke kind of simultaneously. And some of that is because they're true believers, of course. And, I doubt that Dalton would be significantly less woke were it not for these accreditation requirements. But I think on the margins, it's like harder to start your own anti-woke school if there's this accreditation bottleneck. And for schools that maybe are a little less gung-ho about the ideology, there's still going to be this pressure for them to hire more and more DEI professionals and do more and more of these conferences, because they don't want to be told in their accreditation, when they're up for reaccreditation, they don't want to be told that they're racist and are in danger of losing their accreditation status. So there is a kind of coercive mechanism at play here where the schools can only really dissent so much from the accreditors without it being a problem.
So I want to ask a different question because it's been on my mind. I had you on the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values podcast, the Speechcast, and I know you're Jewish. Um, One of the arguments that my organization recently made is that these ideologies, in that as much as that they're illiberal, rigid systems of understanding hierarchy of privilege and the like, are fanning the flames of anti-Semitism, in as much as they are a binary of oppressed versus oppressor. Have you seen any of that? Is that something you agree with, or is that something that you just haven't looked at very closely?
Yeah, I think it's broadly true. One under-discussed pathway by which I think they do that is uh, A, by coding Jews as white in the discourse, and B, by anathematizing white people. Um,
Right.
and now, it may not be that they're singling out Jews, qua Jews, although with the Israel-Palestine stuff, there is some of that. But often, I actually think that the deeper issue is, it, when there is anti-Semitism. I mean, the very idea that you would conceive of Jews as a oppressed, protected class doesn't really gel well with this binaristic racial narrative in which everyone is either an oppressed person of color or a white oppressor, because Jews are coded as white. So how could Jews really be oppressed? They're white. White people are the oppressors. I mean, I
And they're
really think,
successful too. I mean, on
yeah,
average, Jews are a
yeah,
successful
oh yeah,
minority.
and that's the other problem. Jews are within white Americans. Jews are one of the demographics that um, often seem to provide evidence for the oppressor-oppressed binary, precisely because among white Americans, Jews are among the most successful. I mean, it's true. So yeah, I think that's a big problem, and one reason I think it's not talked about quite as candidly, maybe as I just phrased it, is it really what this implies is that there is a kind of almost, I would call it, anti-white racism that interacts with and intensifies anti-Semitism insofar as it kind of makes it impossible to cognize groups as a victim of oppression. Um, People don't like to talk about wokeness as a form of anti-white racism, but I do think that there's at least some animus towards white people there that is an important mechanism to perpetuate anti-Semitism, and so I think we ignore that at our peril. Um,
You know, there have been people who have criticized me in recent days for coming out with exactly the kind of findings you just articulated, and said that we are practicing sort of Jewish critical race theory. In other words, we're looking at how biases are embedded in
right.
systems or ideological systems, and we're saying that's causing anti-Semitism. And then here you are doing exactly what critical race theorists do, and calling it a cause of anti-Semitism. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, it's a clever comeback. I don't think it's super persuasive because there's a difference between saying that there are biases woven into a belief system and saying that there are biases woven into structures. First of all, critical race theory really says both of those things, that it's woven into structures and belief systems. And I think your claim is more that it's woven into a belief system, not so much say like, the structure of liberal democratic capitalism, or
Right.
something like that.
That's true. It's a good
But the
point.
other thing I would say is, look, there's nothing a priori crazy about the idea that biases can be ingrained in very subtle ways into the way people think and talk. That's not crazy. And indeed, in the 1970s and 80s, when critical theory was first coming onto the scene, there frankly were just more examples of sort of very loaded language people would use because they didn't want to explicitly state racist opinions, but they clearly had some animus, and so it gets packaged in, say, I mean, there was a real law and order problem, but some of the law and order discourse you could point to probably did convey or serve as a vehicle for a kind of anti-black racism. I mean, That's not like a crazy thing to say historically.
No.
Clearly, there were
Agreed.
points at which and people for whom that is how it worked. But there is, I think, just less evidence for that charge now, and there is less of that obviously woven into the fabric of our discourse. I mean, the very fact that critical race theory has prominent defenders at all mainstream media outlets and in the U.S. military should tell you that the whole just discursive terrain has radically shifted, and that's, I mean, really the main reason, or one of the main reasons, critical race theory is false, is that it makes a series of claims and predictions about reality that, even if they were true at one time, clearly just are not true, or are not true to anywhere near the same degree as now. And so with the to go back to the charge your opponent's level against you, I'd say, look, like, this is an empirical claim, and it needs to be falsifiable, and you need to be able to show your work and say that these biases are woven into discourses of leftism, intersectionality, whatever. But I think that you can do that, right? I mean, I think that you can see that clearly the discourse right now wants to, quote unquote, center a particular set of groups and grievances above others, and that the discourse right now clearly does not conceive of Jews as people of color. I mean, like, I would challenge your opponent to say, so, like, which of those do you disagree with? Do you think that Jews are considered a person of color in the discourse? No, I don't think you do. Do you think that the discourse is, well, maybe they would say, oh, it's still this, like, deeply racist thing, but unless you just are like closing your eyes and living under a rock, I mean, how can you come to any other conclusion than that mainstream elite institutions are obsessed with racism and purging racism and white privilege, etc. I mean, I just think, like, the two central planks of my argument and yours are just so empirically obvious and unimpeachable that, like, to your opponent, I'd be like, well, we're right and critical race theory is wrong. I mean, that's kind of what it comes down to.
But let me ask you something, because you just said something that was interesting to me. So let's go back to the 70s and the 80s, right, where maybe some of the claims of critical race theory were more correct than they are now. I mean, did I understand you right?
Yeah. I think some of them were more correct in the 70s than they are now.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, and I agree with that. But I'm wondering, it's nice that critical race theory came in to at least enforce the dialogue, and perhaps it's because of critical race theory being introduced in the 70s and 80s, where it was more viable that we had this discussion. And so, are we at a place now where it's like it's extinguished its usefulness? Like, it was useful then because it forced a dialogue that actually perhaps was part of the reason why we don't need it anymore. We realized that we were using language that really was destructive. And so, has it just expired?
Well, I think the language thing certainly, I think, has largely expired. But I would actually say the bigger issue is that in the 70s, it was reasonable to conclude that most residual disparities were probably due to some form of racism, or that you couldn't really plausibly blame it on the groups who were on sort of the lower end of those disparities in any way, given how recent the civil rights revolution had been. Today, there is still, I think, a real question about how quickly you would expect to see the gaps close when the sort of formal legal barriers are removed. And maybe the answer is just, it takes longer than 50 years. It's going to take 100 or 150. But the further you get away, I think the harder it is to point to examples of kind of residual racism and the actual workings of systems as being sort of the main causal agent there, especially because there are a whole lot of immigrants, including Black immigrants from, say, Africa or the Caribbean, who don't who don't experience quite the same disparities as African Americans do. And so, I think the deeper issue with critical race theory is that it kind of assumes that all disparities, or at least most of them, are rooted in racism of some kind. Um, but unless you just kind of tautologically redefine racism to mean the presence of racial disparities, which I think is silly and wrong, um, it's not at all clear that systemic racism, of the sort that existed pre civil rights or immediately post civil rights exists today, at least on anywhere near the same level. And thus, it's frankly not at all clear to me that we should be attributing the lion's share of disparities to racism. And then, of course, the comeback is, well, what are you attributing them to, Aaron? Are you saying people are inferior? No, I mean, I think that there are a lot of explanations, and you know, most of the most plausible ones don't absolve African Americans of causal responsibility for their own condition, but also don't necessarily blame them for it, or absolve the rest of the country of any obligation to support policies that are designed to mitigate the conditions of especially poor African Americans. But look, Charles Murray has this new controversial book where he says, I'm going to talk about the causes of racial disparity, or the existence of racial disparities. I won't get into the causes, but I'm going to just say that these are persistent and we really are bad at getting rid of them. We don't know how to, and these are just facts. And the reason he says that is, look, if you're not willing to say it's structural racism, you're left with a very limited set of answers. And if you're not willing to embrace one or some mix of those answers, you're not going to be able to fight critical race theory. So I do think it's important for people to just say, look, clearly this is not all racism. Clearly some of this is either culture or it's maybe class. I think that's an under-discussed one. But you've got to be able to say at some point, right, look, not all the disparities are due to racism. In fact, many of them are not, because otherwise you just can't win this fight.
Right. Can you imagine, though? I completely agree with that, by the way. And I think we liberals have so caved on the idea of culture, for example, that it's very hard now to reclaim that ground. And I'm trying to imagine, what would it be like to talk about disparities in, let's say, a senior high school social studies class, right? Where you say, okay, we're not going to teach a CRT version of disparity. We're going to diversify the conversation, bring in other sources, and we're going to ask you to read Ibram X. Kendi, but we're also going to ask you to read Glenn Lowry or John McWhorter, right, and so forth, and read those sources and then have a discussion. Can you imagine schools being able to do that? I mean, we seem so far away from that. I think it would immediately be protested as racism. And I suspect rather than do that, they would just simply banish the whole subject matter from schools and not allow kids to talk about it. What is your take?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what the roadmap is for getting there, other than just making the best arguments we can.
I think it could be banished from schools. That's actually the best case scenario, realistically. The worst case scenario, which is more likely, is that they would just reprimand the teacher who assigned Lowry and say, but you can still assign Kendi, that's fine. Right. I would say, and this brings it back to my reporting a little, part of it is you have to go after the institutions that are kind of making this stuff into just background noise and sort of trying to inject it into the very air we breathe. And so, I think that simply raising awareness about institutional capture is useful, because it gives people something to rally around. I think Chris Rufo's reporting on schools and Fortune 500 companies has been useful, because he gave it a name, critical race theory, but B, he identified a very concrete battleground, which was schools and companies. I think just, yeah, the raising awareness and raising awareness of institutionalized character is step one. And then step two is finding political, either grassroots mobilization to reclaim institutions, like, showing up to school board meetings and things like that. But I think it also, frankly, is going to have a political component, because the logic of bureaucracies and institutions, there's this kind of natural tendency towards inertia, and it's not like you're going to persuade people with rational arguments. Go to the was it her name, Allison Collins? There's like that crazy school board person in San Francisco who was saying all these horrible things about Asians, and right, like you're not gonna persuade Allison Collins with a rational argument. Like, what you have to do is remove her from the school board and make it harder for people like her to be elected. So, you could make school board elections on the same cycle as presidential elections. Like, I've heard that that's a reform people have thrown out, because then people will just be more likely to be engaged, and they're not going to be these low turnout activist dominated things. That's like a concrete thing. What else? I mean, you could.
Should liberals be illiberal in the way that they battle illiberalism?
Well, yeah. So this is always the issue, right? I mean, I don't think that changing when school board elections are is illiberal, right?
No, it's not.
And I also don't think that a state legislature setting the content of school curricula as state legislatures already have the power to do. Like, that's not in and of itself illiberal. I think the way it's done often is too heavy-handed, and like you do what Florida did, which was ban any perspective that does not locate sort of the essence of America and identity in the Declaration of Independence. I mean, that's stupid for a lot of reasons, one of which is that you basically just banned Russell Kirk, Sam Huntington, and David Hackett Fisher, which are like things that all conservatives should read, and it's actually basically bans like kind of a conservative culturalist, Anglo-Saxon account of American identity. It's stupid. But like, there are better versions of the bill that have been drafted. Like Jim Copland at the Manhattan Institute has put together draft legislation, which is very carefully worded, designed to not ban discussion of the stuff, just ban sort of the promotion of it. And the most important thing it does is it promotes transparency and would require schools to disclose any materials that relate to race, gender, diversity, civil rights, anything like that. I think that kind of thing is really quite consistent with classical liberalism. It's based on its transparency and market-oriented principles, just giving parents the information. It's a mix. It's a kind of statist intervention designed to preserve the promise of classical liberalism against the threat of institutional illiberalism. I think that's probably the best approach. I don't think it's perfect, but to the extent there's a role for state action, it's in creating as favorable, sort of propitious conditions as possible for people within a liberal system to fight back kind of within the means of liberalism and democracy. You can't like ban woke nonprofits and foundations that are peddling this stuff as nice as that might sound in theory, because that's the road to totalitarianism. So the best thing to do is to just limit those foundations and nonprofits' ability to just totally capture everything and shut parents up. That's kind of, I think, all you can hope for.
Or I would say, like, teach DEI, that's fine, teach diversity. But what David, kind of going back what David was saying, is what we're not teaching, though, is critical thinking. So where I would love a class on diversity where it is, like what David said, read this, read that. And actually make it a diverse, instead of what we keep on adding to the acronym, it's diversity, equity, inclusion, and now it's diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Maybe it should be diversity, equity, inclusion, and critical thinking. Maybe it should be DEIC.
Well, I would actually, I might just say it should be diversity, where diversity is
mm.
understood to mean diversity of opinion as
Right.
well as diversity of skin color or religion.
For sure.
But I actually, yeah, I will say well, I'm all for making people feel included within reason and feeling a sense of belonging within reason. But the
Mm,
reality is that these are extremely subjective concepts
mm,
that are designed to be politicized and hijacked by competing ideological factions. And so I
mm.
don't really want, frankly, I mean, I know like this is not maybe politically what like Chris Rufo should say. I mean, I would not advise him or to do this, but like my actual view is that schools should like not really care quite as much as they seem to about inclusion, because or rather like I mean if you really were serious about inclusion, you'd want to include the like evangelical Christian kids,
Of
right?
course.
But
Right.
they don't, and we all know that they don't, and we all know that that's not really what inclusion means. And so yeah, like I don't even want to cede the language to them, quite frankly,
Mm,
because there's a whole network of nonprofits and special interests and administrators and bureaucrats who are invested in defining these terms in a very particular way. And I think it helps them when you use the terms yourself. And I just don't see why we have to. Like we can convey that we care about some version of inclusion and diversity and equity or whatever without without using the words. I mean, I just I mean the biggest one that we absolutely should not get ground on, I think, is the term systemic racism.
mm,
I mean, even if you think that there's a definition, there's a sense in which that exists and is a problem, it's just so poorly defined and so obviously part of this mimetic closed system that really stifles all dissent. I don't think it's wise to use it.
mm.
Talk about the legacy of racism. I think that's a little better. Talk about persistent racial disparities if you want. That's at least objective and descriptive. Term systemic racism, I think, combines the descriptive and the normative in a really dangerous way. Like
Right.
I don't actually want schools to use that word. Like
Mhm,
I
mhm.
think we should actively push for that to get that out of schools, frankly.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you could just talk about systemic racism in the descriptive sense. I understand it's gained currency in the normative sense as well, and it's hard to sort of disentangle the normative from the descriptive in that way. I might push back. I mean, it's an interesting point on DEI. I might push back because I think what's going to happen is that companies, if we are successful in pushing back enough and eliciting a backlash here, are going to still need a landing pad for diversity. There's still going to be internal pressures. There's still going to be legal pressures because of the way that our law is set up around discrimination for companies to have DEI. So what you want to be able to do is say, oh, we're going to give you DEI, but it's going to actively incorporate viewpoint diversity there and thereby mitigate the effects of the ideology on DEI as the way that it's done today. So
Sure.
I mean, these are tough questions, and
But
it's hard. It's so emblazoned in the public imagination that we need to have diversity at work that I'm not sure we would succeed in redefining that in the
I mean,
public
the
mind.
other thing I would say is that civil rights law may be a good tool. And there have
Yeah,
already been attempts to sort of say, look, these anti-white struggle sessions, this
this
violates
is
the plain
beyond.
text
Yeah,
of the civil rights law. I mean, I think that's a good tactic to kind of conservatives say, see, we stand for civil rights. We just stand for a universalist, colorblind conception of it, and really push for that. That might, and even maybe write laws that specify the way we will interpret the civil rights law, which is great, by the way. We love civil rights. Is that it applies to every group, including white people, including men, including cisgendered heterosexuals. It applies to everyone. I mean that I think is a place where you can maybe succeed in reclaiming the terms precisely because there is this longer, deeper tradition of a kind of colorblind civil rights discourse in the United States. So there I agree with you that, like, we don't have to totally give up the language.
Well, this has been very interesting and instructive, and I'm so glad you've been covering the stories you cover, because I think you have such an important niche, and we're going to be reading you very carefully, waiting for the information that you've been able to uncover that those of us sometimes in the activist world can't do on our own. So thanks for what you do, and very much appreciate it.
Yeah,
Thank you
Aaron,
so much.
I was just going to add to that before I let you go. I mean, some of these stories that you told about the accreditation and the CDC, I don't see that anywhere else. I mean, the talk about critical thinking, I mean, you really looked at some of the background into both of those that I never have seen anywhere. And so, yeah, thank you for keep doing what you're doing. I hope that it expands and that we see at least this access to information in outlets outside of, small niches.
Right.
So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Hold My Drink. Like or subscribe to the show and check out the show notes for links to source material and to our website, where you can find what each of us is reading every week, different news with different views. If you have a topic that you would like us to explore, drop us a line. And join us next week as we say, hold my drink, and the conversation gets real.